My name is Sarah. I am 32 years old, and my heart completely stopped beating the second I heard the sickening crunch of glass shattering against the cold granite of my father's kitchen island. My dad, a man who always believed his wealth gave him the right to step on anyone, had just forcefully grabbed my husband's wrist and violently slammed his arm down. The cheap $30 watch my husband wore, the very first gift I ever bought him when we were broke college students, was completely destroyed, its broken gears and twisted metal scattered across the expensive countertop. I stood there, completely paralyzed, feeling a mix of profound humiliation and intense rage boiling up in my chest.
My dad just laughed, a cruel, mocking sound, wiping his hands as if he had just taken out the trash, looking at my husband with pure disgust. But what my father didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have imagined in his arrogant little world, was the devastating secret my husband had been quietly working on for months, a secret that was about to explode. Before I tell you exactly how we completely turned the tables and destroyed his arrogant empire just 5 days later, I want to pause for a second and ask you something. I always love knowing how far my stories are reaching and connecting with people, so please, let me know in the comments down below. From which city and state are you listening to this story right now? It really warms my heart to see where you all are from.
Now, to truly make you understand the sheer magnitude of what happened in that kitchen and why that broken watch was the absolute last straw, I have to take you back a little bit. I need to explain the toxic dynamic that had been suffocating my marriage for years, all because of my father's disgusting obsession with money, status, and control over everyone around him. My father, Richard, who is 60 years old, built a regional construction supply company from the ground up. He is the kind of man who measures a person's entire worth by the brand of their shoes and the zip code of their house. I always hated that about him. When I met my husband, Mark, who is now 34 years old, we were just struggling students.
Mark came from a very humble background. His parents worked multiple minimum wage jobs just to keep food on the table. He didn't have fancy clothes or a trust fund, but he had an incredible work ethic, a brilliant mind for numbers, and a heart of gold. I fell in love with his kindness and his quiet determination. For our first anniversary, I saved up my tips from my waitressing job and bought him a simple $30 watch with a brown leather strap. It wasn't much, but to Mark, it was a Rolex. He swore he would never take it off, and for years, he kept that promise to me. Of course, the very first time I brought Mark home to meet my family, my father took one look at his scuffed shoes and that cheap watch and instantly categorized him as a loser.
During that first dinner, he aggressively interrogated Mark about his career plans, laughing openly when Mark said he was studying finance. For the next decade, my father made it his personal mission to make Mark feel completely inadequate at every single family gathering. My younger sister, Emily, who is 29 years old, was the only person in the family who actually saw how toxic my dad was being. Emily would often pull me aside during Thanksgiving or Christmas dinners, shaking her head as my dad loudly bragged about his newest sports car. "I don't know how Mark stays so calm, Sarah," Emily would whisper to me, looking at my husband with genuine respect. Mark would just smile politely, nod at my father's insults, and quietly check the time on his worn-out watch.
But my father completely failed to realize was that while he was busy showing off his wealth and spending money he didn't actually have, Mark was quietly building an empire of his own. Mark started his financial advisory firm from our tiny apartment, working 18-hour days, analyzing markets and making brilliant investments. Slowly but surely, he began acquiring commercial real estate and taking over failing businesses to turn them around. By the time Mark was 32, he was secretly worth more than my father had ever been at the peak of his career. But Mark never bought a flashy car. He never bought designer clothes, and he definitely never replaced that cheap leather watch I gave him. He always said that the watch was his anchor, a constant reminder of where we started, and the pure love that kept us going when we had absolutely nothing in our bank accounts.
On the other hand, My father's construction supply business was slowly bleeding out. He took out massive, high-interest loans to maintain his lavish personal lifestyle, putting up a flawless facade of endless wealth. But behind closed doors, things were crumbling. Mark knew the truth because he was a master at reading the financial paper trails. This all culminated 5 days before the most explosive moment of my entire life. My dad had invited the whole family over for a lavish Sunday dinner at his massive suburban mansion, claiming he was celebrating a huge new contract. Emily called me that morning, sounding anxious. "Sarah, something feels wrong," she told me over the phone. "Dad is acting manic. Mom let it slip that his credit cards were declining last week. Just be careful tonight." Mark just gave me a calm smile, touched his old watch, and told me he wouldn't miss this dinner for the world. When we arrived at my father's estate, the sheer desperation was palpable beneath the expensive decorations. My dad was drinking heavily, holding a glass of expensive scotch, and talking loudly to anyone who would listen about how brilliant he was. When he saw Mark walk through the door, his eyes locked onto him like a predator spotting a wounded animal.
"Ah, the financial genius has arrived," my dad yelled across the room, his voice slurred and dripping with heavy sarcasm. "Tell me, Mark, how are the penny stocks doing today? Still managing other people's loose change?" I felt my face flush with immediate embarrassment and anger. I grabbed Mark's arm, ready to turn around and walk right back out the front door. But Mark gently placed his hand over mine, keeping me in place. "I am doing just fine, Richard," Mark replied evenly, his voice incredibly steady. "Just keeping an eye on the market." The tension at the dinner table was so thick you could have cut it with a steak knife. My dad sat at the head of the long dining table, holding court, while the rest of us ate in uncomfortable silence. Every chance he got, he directed a thinly veiled insult toward my husband.
He talked about ambition, about what it takes to be a real man in the business world, constantly implying that Mark was weak and poor. Emily kept shooting me terrified glances from across the table, silently begging me to intervene. I tried to change the subject multiple times. I asked my dad about his golf game, about his upcoming vacation, anything to distract him. But he was relentless. It was as if he needed to tear Mark down to make himself feel taller. He was a drowning man, trying to stand on my husband's shoulders to keep his own head above the water, completely oblivious to the fact that he was rapidly sinking. The breaking point happened right after dessert. We were all standing around the massive granite kitchen island, waiting for coffee to brew.
Mark was checking his phone, probably reading an email from one of his senior analysts, when he briefly pulled back his sleeve to check the time on his watch. That tiny, innocent movement caught my father's eye, and something inside him just snapped. Maybe it was the alcohol, maybe it was the crushing weight of his hidden debts, but he lunged forward. "You know what absolutely sickens me about you, Mark?" my dad spat out, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of red. "You have been married to my daughter for 8 years, and you still wear this piece of absolute garbage on your wrist. You have zero pride. You are a walking, talking embarrassment to my family name." He was practically shaking with blind, irrational rage at this point.
I stepped in between them immediately, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Dad, stop it right now! You are drunk, and you are completely out of line!" I shouted, my voice trembling with a mixture of fear and absolute fury. But my father completely ignored me. He reached around me and grabbed Mark's left wrist with a vicious, bruising grip. He pulled Mark's arm up, displaying the worn leather watch like it was a piece of disgusting evidence in a trial. "Look at this. Look at this pathetic piece of junk," my dad roared, spit flying from his mouth. "A real man provides. A real man shows the world his success. This watch proves that you are exactly what I always knew you were, a worthless, bottom-feeding loser who will never amount to anything in this life." The entire kitchen went dead silent. Even the catering staff froze in the hallway, eyes wide with pure shock. Mark didn't pull away. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked my father dead in the eyes with a chilling,
terrifying calmness that I had never seen before. "The watch stays, Richard," Mark said, his voice dropping to a low, icy whisper that sent shivers down my spine. "It reminds me of the things that actually matter." That calm defiance was the match that ignited my father's explosive rage. With a guttural scream of pure frustration, my father twisted Mark's arm downward and violently slammed his wrist against the sharp edge of the granite countertop. The sickening crunch of the glass vase shattering echoed through the kitchen like a gunshot. The metal casing dented, the tiny gears popped out, and the leather strap snapped under the brutal force of the impact. My father let go, panting heavily, a sick, victorious smirk spreading across his sweaty red face. I screamed. I actually screamed. I dropped to my knees, frantically trying to gather the tiny broken pieces of the watch from the cold stone floor, my vision completely blurred by thick, hot tears. That watch wasn't just an accessory. It was the symbol of our entire life together. It was the late nights eating instant noodles, the shared dreams in our freezing first apartment, the pure, unconditional love we built from absolutely nothing. Seeing it destroyed felt like watching someone physically assault my memories. "You are a monster!" I screamed at my father, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I held the broken leather strap. Emily ran over to me, crying, trying to help me pick up the shattered glass. My dad just stood there, towering over us, completely unrepentant. "I did him a favor," my dad sneered coldly. "Maybe now he will buy a real watch and stop embarrassing us in public." I expected Mark to finally snap. I expected him to punch my father right in his arrogant face. But Mark did something far more terrifying. He calmly knelt down beside me, gently took the broken pieces of the watch from my trembling hands, and put them carefully into his suit pocket. He then stood up, adjusted his cuffs, and looked at my father with a gaze so intensely cold it could have frozen the ocean. "Are you finished, Richard?" Mark asked, his voice completely devoid of any emotion. My father blinked, clearly taken aback by the absolute lack of fear or anger in Mark's response. "Get out of my house," my dad muttered, suddenly looking much older and much smaller. Mark nodded slowly. "We are leaving," he said. He turned to me, offered me his hand, and helped me off the floor. As we walked out the front door, Mark didn't look back, but I did, and I saw a man standing alone, realizing his mistake. The car ride home was agonizingly silent. I sat in the passenger seat, quietly sobbing into a tissue. "I am cutting him out of my life," I choked out. Mark gently squeezed my knee. "Do not apologize, Sarah, and do not cry over the watch. It can be fixed. But your father is fundamentally broken. It is time he learned how the real world works." The very next morning, the wheels of Mark's vengeance began to turn. I woke up at 6 to find Mark sitting at the kitchen island, surrounded by financial documents. He was on the phone with his lead attorney. "I want the debt acquired by noon today," I heard him say. "Buy out the commercial loans from First National and contact the private equity firm holding his second mortgage. I want all of his paper consolidated under our holding company." I stood there, paralyzed, realizing Mark was going to corporate war, and he was taking no prisoners. When Mark finally hung up the phone, he looked at me and let out a long, exhausted sigh. He motioned for me to sit down next to him. He opened a massive, thick folder and pushed it across the counter toward me. "I didn't want to tell you this, Sarah, because I know he is your father," Mark began, his voice incredibly gentle but firm. "But Richard's company has been functionally bankrupt for over 2 years. He owes millions to suppliers. His commercial real estate is leveraged to the absolute limit, and he has been dodging margin calls for months. I have been quietly monitoring his decline through the financial networks, trying to figure out a way to step in and save the employees' jobs before he crashed the whole thing into the ground. But after last night, I am not playing the role of the silent savior anymore. I am taking the company. Today, I am going to buy him out completely." Over the next 3 days, Mark orchestrated a completely legal,
utterly devastating financial takeover. It was like watching a master chess player execute a flawless checkmate that had been set up 20 moves in advance. Because my father's loans were in default, the banks were more than happy to sell the toxic debt to Mark's investment firm at a steep discount. By Wednesday, Mark's company owned every single mortgage on my father's warehouses, every lien on his heavy machinery, and the primary credit line that kept the business's daily operations running.
Mark essentially owned my father's entire world, and my father had absolutely no idea. Emily called me on Thursday afternoon in a total panic. "Sarah, Dad's office is in chaos," she whispered over the phone. "The bank just froze all of his corporate accounts. He is screaming at his accountant, throwing things. It is completely over. He is ruined." Part of me felt a sharp pang of guilt. He was, after all, the man who raised me. Despite his arrogance and his cruelty, watching him lose everything he had spent his entire life building was a heavy burden to carry. I paced around our living room, staring at the empty space on the counter where Mark usually kept his watch.
I thought about calling my dad, about warning him, about begging Mark to show some mercy. But then I remembered the sound of that glass shattering. I remembered the sickening smirk on my father's face as he tried to strip my husband of his dignity. I remembered the dark bruise on Mark's wrist. My father didn't just break a watch. He tried to break a man's spirit, purely for his own sick entertainment. He needed to be stopped, not just for Mark's sake, but for the sake of all the innocent employees he was dragging down with his reckless ego. I buried my guilt and stood by Mark. Exactly 5 days after the disastrous family dinner, Friday morning arrived. Mark put on his best tailored suit, the one he only wore for major corporate acquisitions.
I decided to go with them. I needed to be there. I needed to look my father in the eyes when the illusion of his superiority was finally shattered. We drove to the massive, imposing headquarters of Richard's Hardware and Supply. The parking lot was half empty, a grim testament to the failing state of the business. As we walked through the glass double doors, the receptionist looked up, her eyes red and puffy from crying. Rumors of the bankruptcy had clearly spread through the office like wildfire. "We are here to see Richard," Mark said politely, not waiting for an answer as he strode purposefully toward the executive suite at the end of the long hallway. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst right through my chest.
Mark pushed open the heavy oak doors of my father's office without knocking. The room was a complete disaster. Papers were scattered everywhere, and my father was slumped behind his massive mahogany desk, looking pale, defeated, and aggressively disheveled. When he saw us walk in, his face twisted into a mask of pure rage. "What the hell are you doing here?" he screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "Get out of my office before I have security throw you out."
Mark calmly pulled up a leather chair and sat down directly across from my father, placing a stack of legal documents on the desk. "Security will not answer, Richard," Mark said quietly. "I let the head of security go 10 minutes ago. I have just frozen all operations in this building." My father stared at Mark, confused. "What are you talking about?" he sneered. Mark leaned forward. "The firm that bought all of your defaulted loans, Richard. That is my firm. I own this company now." The silence that followed was the heaviest thing I have ever experienced. I watched as the blood completely drained from my father's face. He looked at the documents, recognizing the logos of the banks that had held his debt.
He looked at Mark's immaculate suit and then down at Mark's left wrist, where a brand new, perfectly repaired $30 watch with a fresh glass face sat proudly. Mark had paid a specialist double to fix it overnight. You bought my debt?" my father whispered, his voice completely hollowed out, stripped of all its former arrogance. "Yes," Mark replied firmly, "and I am stepping in as the new CEO effective immediately. You are being forced into early retirement, Richard. I will give you a small severance package, enough to pay off your personal house, but you are done in this industry. You will never treat an employee or my wife with disrespect ever again. It is over." Looking back on that day, I realized that true power doesn't come from the volume of your voice, the price of your clothes, or the cruelty of your actions. True power comes from patience, hard work, and knowing exactly who you are, regardless of what anyone else thinks. My father lost his empire because he valued his ego more than his family, while my husband built an even stronger empire by valuing the things that truly matter, like a cheap leather watch given with love and sacrifice. Have you ever had to cut a toxic family member out of your life to protect your peace? And would you have the courage to do what we did? Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. I will be reading them all. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I hope it brought you some value. Until the next story.